The plug. To pull
or not to pull.
To begin, we must understand what pulling the plug is. So what does pulling the plug actually mean? This phrase is an idiom which represents the action of preventing something to happen or from continuing. In the case of our real-life situation, this idiom represents the choice of ending a life. Pulling the plug means taking away life support from a patient, whether they be in critical condition or a long-term state. Let's now look at this theoretical situation and see how our minds will react when given a tough, potentially life-taking decision.
Your loved one was in a recent accident and has been hospitalized for a few weeks. He or she is currently in a coma or a vegetative state and is dependent on life support to maintain homeostatic conditions within his or her body. After receiving the doctor's news, you realize that the patient has no chance of regaining consciousness again. However, the patient's last request was to not be taken off life support. The hospital bills continue to increase, trying to support life until a natural death occurs. You are in a position of choosing to take away life support and save money, or respecting the patient's last request. So, what do? This is a huge decision. The plug. To pull or not to pull? That is the question.
To come up with an answer for deciding the value of someone's life is particularly difficult. This theoretical situation is not as uncommon as it may seem. Similarly, there was a medical case from 1990 to 2005 that dealt with this life or death situation. Terry Schiavo was a completely healthy woman in 1990, maintaining jobs in the restaurant business. Due to some unknown reason that doctors are still unable to identify, Terry collapsed in her own home and oxygen was cut off from her brain for several continuous minutes. Terry's husband Michael and the doctors blamed the collapse on a cardiac arrest due to insufficient potassium levels from bulimia. Terry's family saying her husband strangled her because of the neck injury she sustained from the day of her fall. Although Terry suffered severe brain damage, she was able to breathe and maintain a steady heartbeat and blood pressure by herself. She was fed through a feeding tube through her stomach to sustain her life. Here is a clip from a documentary showing just how severe Terry's condition was after the collapse.
Terry's wish and the ruling from Judge George Greer of the 6th Judicial Court in Clearwater, Florida, said that Terry should not be kept alive by artificial means, including a feeding tube. The family fought the court and her husband, saying that, quote, she had a strong will to survive. However, who gets to make this decision of whether or not a life should be preserved or not? Is it the person, themselves, or their loved ones? If the patient is mentally impaired, such as Terry, should the husband or parents be given that choice?
Terry Schiavo's case started long before the cameras appeared. It was February of 1990 when the 26-year-old suffered a cardiac arrest.
She went several minutes without oxygen from her collapse and experienced a profound brain injury. The first couple days, doctors didn't know if she was going to live or die.
Lack of oxygen left Schiavo with severe brain damage and in what doctors call a persistent vegetative state, or PVS, a condition in which the parts of the brain that control thinking and awareness are damaged or destroyed. Only the brainstem, which controls basic reflexes like breathing, remains. Initially, Terry's husband and parents cared for her together, exploring potential treatments and rehabilitation. But 4 years after her collapse, Michael Schiavo says doctors gave him a grim prognosis.
It was to a point where Terry wasn't going to function. There was nothing more, and they told us, her mother was sitting right there at the time. There was nothing more they can do for Terry.
These questions lead into a bigger topic to be discussed. How does a certain individual make these life or death decisions? For example, do they use reason, or emotion, or even faith to decide what is best? How do they let these ways of knowing affect their decision on schema? For the purpose of this real-life situation, we will be discussing this particular knowledge question. To what extent does emotion, reason, and faith affect decisions on schema? To fully understand the knowledge question, we need to define the key terms of the question, which are emotion, reason, and faith.
What truly is emotion? Emotion is a natural, instinctive state of mind deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationships with others. Another definition is that it's a psychological state that arrives spontaneously rather than through conscious effort. What is reason? Reason is the power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic. Emotion and reason are connected on the basis that emotion provides the basis for all moral beliefs, and reason is then used to reinforce and provide context for the belief. What is faith? Faith is the complete trust or confidence in someone or something. In our modern society, faith is usually associated with a strong belief in God or other religious figures based on spiritual apprehension over proof.
Now we must discuss to what extent do these ways of knowing affect our decisions on schema. In the topic of decision making based upon schema, it is best to describe emotion and reasoning together because they go hand in hand in the process. Emotion plays the greater role over reasoning in decision making strategies. Although they lack a sophistication and precision as compared to reason, emotions guide that instant gut feeling decision that you initially want to choose. Emotion is generally subconscious and reactive, allowing an individual to prove a point or avoid danger. On the contrary, reason is the conscious decision maker, generally slower than emotion because of the activation needed within the brain neurons. Although they differ greatly, reason is very closely tied with emotion. Emotions create the bounds for reasoning, which allows the mind to focus on a specific topic of reason. However, what would happen if a person did not have a sense of emotion caused from medical circumstances? Scientist Antonio Damasio actually answered this question and proved that decision making and emotion are tied together in a physiological way. While reviewing results of a mentally impaired patient, he realized that the brain damage to their emotional sector of the brain inhibited the patient's ability to be able to make decisions for themselves. They were able to think about many logical reasonings for an answer and used their reasoning to come up with what should be logistical conclusion to test questions. However, when the patients were presented with a specific question, such as choosing a meal, patients were completely unable to arrive at a decision even after thinking of many possible answers. This provides evidence showing how emotion is a much more important contender to decision making than reason.
Now, let's apply this to schema. Remember that schema describes patterns of thought or behavior, a mental structure of preconceived ideas. Schema is personal and is based upon an individual's background and experiences. When decisions are made, an individual will use their past experiences and knowledge to predict the future of what they might encounter. Emotions, as we discovered, are the most important part in making decisions because of the relationships an individual develops with something in their lives. It is instinctual to have these connections with their surroundings, thus making decisions based on these connections, such as family or personal passions, will be quick and instinctual usually. The only countering to emotion, however, is reasoning in this case. Emotion sets the boundaries for reasoning. However, reasoning may hold an individual back from what they truly desire to do about their decision on schema. Reason makes the individual rethink their initial decision because even though they have established relationships and gained experience, emotions are still lacking a certain amount of precision due to their lack of process behind it. In other words, to sum it up, emotion creates the initial decision based on connections, but reasoning reevaluates the potential outcome of the decision and whether it is best in the future.
Faith is another way of knowing which affects our decision making process. It is a way of thinking that has no backing support behind it. There is no fact or logic to provide evidence that a decision is valuable or sensible. The individual hopes for the outcome they want, trusting the future to the hands of fate rather than using earthly materials and logic to think of a more valid answer. Faith, especially in this society, refers a lot to a belief in a higher being, trusting that all will turn out for the best. When applying this to decisions on schema, faith is quite similar to emotion. The individual generates an answer, whether plausible or not, and sticks with it, sometimes rejecting the most reasonable and possible outcome. The individual has these developed connections and experience that they have grown up with and hope that everything will turn out positively like it had in the past or for someone else. Faith overall does help influence decisions, however, it is not always the best route to take when trying to make serious decisions. Leave that to reasoning.
Now, let's tie this back to Terry Schiavo and the court case centered around this right to die situation. Emotion, reason, and faith were all utilized to develop a final verdict on her life. Starting with Michael Schiavo, Terry's husband, he had developed an emotional connection with Terry considering their long-time marriage. However, Michael, alongside the doctors, utilized reason behind their decision to pull the plug because of the prognosis. Terry had no chance of returning to her former self. She would have remained in a vegetative state until a natural death. Also, Terry made it clear before her accident that she would not want to be on a critical life support. So Michael used this in his fight to reason that it was best to pull the plug on Terry's life. Michael prioritized reasoning over emotion to conclude that for Terry's best interest, she should not be sustained artificially by a feeding tube. Terry's family, in contrary, although recognizing her incurable state, based their decision on their emotional connection with Terry before the incident and the faith that there might be a miracle to bring her back to her former mental state. They saw every action she made, whether a muffled sound or a slight movement of the body, as a will to survive. However, they were clinging on to an incurable patient. Everybody's initial decision was to protect her, and they did for 4 straight years. However, Michael saw beyond his emotions and realized that there was no hope to bring her back. Now, let's see what the final verdict was after 15 years of disputing. Did Terry's family or Michael win the case? Did they pull the plug on Terry?
And on March 31st, 2005, the long, painful public struggle was over.
The end came this morning for Terry Schiavo, and her husband's lawyer says she died peacefully 13 days after her feeding tube was removed.
Terry, we love you dearly, but we know that God loves you more than we do. We must accept your untimely death as God's will.
Schiavo's autopsy eventually confirmed what had been so hotly contested for years in court proceedings. The damage to her brain had been massive and irreversible.
Emotion, reason, and faith affect our schema in more situations other than having the decision to pull the plug. These can be found in many other areas of knowledge besides ethics. Looking at history, many people have been faced with situations where their emotion, reason, and faith played a factor in guiding them through a difficult decision. A perfect example of this is in the mid-19th century during the time of slavery. The Underground Railroad was established to help get slaves to freedom in the North and Canada. White Americans made the decision to offer their homes as safe houses for the traveling slaves and help them on their journey to freedom. Although the decision to help the slaves was very risky and could have negative consequences if caught, the emotion, reason, and faith influenced their decision to aid these African Americans. Emotion came into play in that these white Southerners had empathy for the slaves. Their emotion compelled them to look past the color of their skin and see them as an actual human being, not as a piece of property. In addition to empathy, these people also felt guilt about what was going on. After seeing the brutality of slave owners, people were embarrassed by the action of Americans, especially being that at this time the U.S. was one of very few nations that had not yet abolished slavery. Empathy and guilt influenced their decision to help slaves to freedom. Following emotion, Reason caused them to see that African Americans were people too, and they didn't deserve to be treated the way slave owners treated them. They had thoughts that if African Americans are people, they should not be treated as animals or property. By seeing this, they knew that the only way slaves could escape this torture was to head north, where there were laws against slavery. To finish this example, faith comes in as a factor in that most of people were Christians at the time, and they lived by a religion that taught them that all people were created equally, regardless of color. Therefore, the slaves were being mistreated, and as a Christian, the right thing to do would be to provide a safe place for them to rest in their journey to freedom from the cruel treatment of slave owners.
Another area of knowledge that our knowledge question applies to is art. In art, emotion, reason, and faith are what drive how we interpret the message and the meaning within a painting or work. For example, when we look at a painting, one of the first things we notice are the colors. When we view a certain color, we often associate them with specific emotions. Having this relationship between colors and emotion leads to many different interpretations of a single painting, because people derive different emotions from the same color. So when two people are looking at the same painting, they may have a different perspective because one person may see green and think the painting is a representation of greed or corruption. However, one person may see the painting as a representation of jealousy. This demonstrates that by simply linking emotion with colors, it can affect the decisions we make in interpreting a piece of art. Reason affects our interpretations, and that logic and reason helps us to decipher what the things in an artwork can mean. When looking at a painting and when seeing two colors together and certain symbols, logic can cause us to draw a conclusion about an underlying connection between them that reveals the purpose of the piece of art. In artwork, we tend to draw conclusions on the meaning or message based on what our religious beliefs are as well. For example, when we see a cross, we tend to associate it with God or the Holy Bible, which makes us interpret the piece to have a connection there. Another example is that when we see fire and dark colors, we assume the message of artwork has a correlation to hell or the underworld. After examining how our brain interprets art, it is clear that emotion, reason, and faith are the basis of our decision-making process within schema.
Now that we have explored our knowledge question within a number of areas of knowledge, it is clear the extent of which emotion, reason, and faith affect our decisions on schema. The three factors are necessary for the decision-making process. Furthermore, emotion is critical from a physiological standpoint, as proved by Dr. Damasio, and is necessary for us to make a rational decision because the boundaries of reason are set by emotion. Faith is based upon a foundation that is set by emotion, however abandoning reason. Reason, emotion, and faith all tie into our schema based on individual backgrounds and experiences. Thus, without these ways of knowing and a past to reminisce upon, decisions about schema will be impossible.
Thank you, Mr. Critchley, for bearing through our video. For pure enjoyment, here is a Family Guy clip about Terry.
Hi, Doctor. It's me, Michael Shivo. How's my wife doing?
She's a vegetable.
I hate vegetables.
Don't worry about her, Mr. Shivo. She's being kept alive by medical science.
Gee, look at all this stuff. How does it all work?
Well, I'll tell you.
This one keeps her liver clean. This one checks her pee.
How about this one over here?
Oh, that's just the TV.
Ha ha ha!
This one checks her heart rate. This one checks her veins. And this dispenses gravy for her mashed potato brains.
Oh, oh, oh! Terry Shivo is kind of alive-o. What a lively little bugger.
Maybe we should just unplug her.